Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the disappearance of three little girls in 1989 and the chilling audio tape discovered over 3 decades later that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. Time does not erase trauma. It buries it under the dense, compacting layers of routine and willful forgetting. The deepest wounds lie dormant, their terrible energy contained, waiting patiently for a single incidental tremor of chance to fracture the surface once more. For the quiet, unassuming town of Milbrook, Tennessee, a place that had long since defined itself by the peace that followed its greatest tragedy. That tremor arrived in the blistering, suffocating heat of the 2023 summer. It came 34 years after a scar was carved so deep into its collective soul that it had never truly ceased to ache. The reckoning began not with a scream in the night, but with the mundane, percussive sounds of renewal, the groan of stressed metal giving way, the sharp, percussive crack of splintering wood, and the flat, final crash of falling drywall. On the forgotten industrial edge of town, where the manicured lawns of the suburbs gave way to cracked asphalt and chain-link fences, a long-abandoned building was being systematically dismantled. It had once been a small, independent electronics repair shop, a relic from a pre-digital age of vacuum tubes and cathode rays. Its purpose made utterly obsolete by the relentless march of time and technology. A construction crew, tasked with exorcising this ghost of commerce to make way for a block of modern, characterless apartments, moved through its debris-choked shell. The air inside was a strange, layered cocktail of scents, the damp, organic smell of decades of decay mingling with the sharp, phantom aroma of ancient solder and the acrid tang of burnt ozone, a scent that clung to the very bones of the structure. It was in the back, in a small windowless room that had likely served as a workshop, that a foreman named David Carter made the discovery, prying away a large, warped panel of drywall that had buckled from years of humidity. He revealed a small, dark, and perfectly square cavity within the wall, and inside that cavity, shrouded in cobwebs and dust, sat a simple cardboard box, its corners softened by the years, sealed not by tape, but by the sheer, uninterrupted weight of 3 decades of silence. David, a man born and raised in the shadow of Milbrook's history, felt an immediate, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The casual, sun-drenched rhythm of the demolition site seemed to fall away, replaced by a sudden, focused quiet. He reached into the dark space, his gloved fingers closing around the brittle cardboard. He pulled the box out, its form so fragile it threatened to disintegrate in his hands. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed, crumbling newspapers used as packing material, lay dozens of cassette tapes. Most were mundane, their handwritten labels detailing recordings of Saturday morning cartoons and top 40 radio hits from the late 1980s. A nostalgic and unremarkable time capsule. But his eyes, scanning the contents, snagged on 3 tapes at the very bottom, set apart from the others as if by design. The cheap plastic cases were yellowed with age, the paper labels stark white against the accumulated grime. The foreman's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, involuntary gasp. The carefully formed, slightly faded blue ink on those labels did not name television shows. They named the town's most infamous ghosts. The three little girls who had vanished into local legend. Their story, a cautionary tale that had transformed Milbrook from a trusting enclave into a community of locked doors and watchful eyes. Emma, Lucy, Mia, and beneath each name, a date that acted as a deep, resonant wound in the town's collective memory. July 15th, 1989, David Carter was only a boy himself that summer, a 10-year-old who had spent his days on a bicycle, blissfully unaware of the world's dangers. But he remembered the fear. He remembered how it had descended on the town like a physical plague, thick and suffocating. He remembered the posters, their smiling, pixelated faces stapled to every telephone pole, their eyes seeming to follow him. He remembered the grim-faced FBI agents in their dark suits, men who looked utterly alien against the backdrop of the quiet suburban streets. Most of all, he remembered the silence the way the familiar. Joyous laughter of children abruptly vanished from the yards and parks, driven indoors by a terror that now had a name. Holding these tapes felt like holding unexploded bombs. They were not mere plastic and magnetic ribbon. They were artifacts from a sealed tomb, vessels containing the final. Unheard whispers from a day that had been violently, inexplicably frozen in time. What terrible symphony of fear and despair had been captured on these fragile, decaying spools? Were they the key to a 34-year-old mystery? Or were they the overture to a horror far worse than anyone had ever dared to imagine? To comprehend the chilling gravity of these relics, to feel the crushing, suffocating weight of their discovery, our journey must rewind. We must leave the dusty, sunlit demolition site of 2023 and plunge back into the oppressive, suffocating humidity of the Tennessee summer in 1989. In that era, Milbrook was the living embodiment of the American dream, a meticulously crafted postcard of suburban tranquility. It was a place where property lines were marked by neatly trimmed hedges, not fences, where local news traveled over the friendly hum of lawnmowers from one neighbor to another, and where the sweet, chiming, slightly off-key melody of an ice cream truck was the day's most urgent and welcome siren. The social contract was simple, powerful, and unspoken. We are a community, and we look out for one another. Doors were left unlocked during the day. Car keys were often left dangling in the ignition, and bicycles were abandoned on front lawns at dusk, always waiting safely for their young owners in the morning dew. Maple Drive was the town's idyllic heart, a long curving street shaded by the vast, paternal canopies of ancient oak trees. Their leaves, thick and green in the summer sun, whispered stories of generations of scraped knees and first loves, of high school graduations and quiet retirements, of a continuity that felt as solid and unbreakable as the pavement itself. This profound, almost radical sense of security was Milbrook's most cherished asset, an invisible shield forged from decades of familiarity and collective trust. It was this shield that allowed parents to shoo their children out into the golden afternoon light with a casual, confident, be home by dinner, certain in the effectiveness of the web of watchful, caring eyes that made up their neighborhood. But this beautiful, peaceful existence was a tragically fragile illusion, for it is in the most serene and placid ponds that the darkest, most patient creatures can lurk unseen beneath the surface. The very trust that defined Milbrook, the very openness that made it a paradise, was also its greatest vulnerability, a wide open, unguarded door through which a patient and calculating evil could silently slip, poisoning the garden from within And on one such sweltering Saturday afternoon, July 15th, on that impossibly safe stretch of Maple Drive, the story's heart began to beat its final, innocent rhythms. Inside the Peterson family's tidy ranch-style home, Janet Peterson moved with an easy, familiar grace through her kitchen, the familiar ritual of preparing lemonade and sandwiches, a comforting anchor in the oppressive afternoon heat. Her mind was a gentle hum of domestic thoughts: what to make for dinner, whether the laundry on the line was dry, the simple, grounding concerns of a contented life. Periodically, she would pause, wiping her hands on her apron, and glance through the large picture window above the sink. The sight in her backyard brought a familiar warmth to her chest, a quiet surge of maternal pride. Her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, a girl whose personality was as bright and bold as the sunflowers growing by the fence, was commanding her small troop. She was the natural leader, the director of their afternoon's elaborate adventures, her voice carrying clearly as she issued imaginary orders. Her loyal second in command was Lucy Brennan, also 8, a girl with a gentle spirit and a quiet, constant smile who lived just 2 houses down. Their friendship was the easy, seamless kind that flourishes in the long, unstructured, sun-drenched days of summer. The trio was completed by 7-year-old Mia Rodriguez. Her family had recently moved to Milbrook from out of state, and Mia, shy and hesitant, was still finding her footing in this new, tight-knit world. Janet had encouraged the friendship, and watching her own outgoing daughter so effortlessly and kindly include the new girl filled her with a deep, quiet satisfaction. Together, they were a whirlwind of secret whispers and sudden bursts of laughter, fully immersed in a complex game of their own invention called Secret Agents. The sprawling, 100-year-old oak tree was their undisputed headquarters, its thick, gnarled trunk and low-hanging branches providing the perfect cover for their imaginary missions against a host of non-existent foes. They were safe. They were happy. They were home. But a single discordant note hung in the air of this perfect domestic symphony, a detail so minor, so insignificant, it barely registered in Janet's consciousness. The wooden gate at the back of their fenced yard, a gate she meticulously checked and latched every single time the children were playing outside, stood slightly ajar. It created just a sliver of an opening, a thin, vertical line of shadow cutting through the bright, uninterrupted afternoon sun. Perhaps the latch hadn't caught properly in the humid air. Perhaps one of the kids had bumped it during their game. It was a fleeting thought, dismissed as quickly and easily as it came. But that gate was more than an oversight. It was a breach. It was the silent, unnoticed tearing of the very fabric of their security. A portal through which an unimaginable and patient nightmare was about to step, ready to swallow 3 little girls and the soul of a town whole. The single, discordant note of the ajar gate hung in the humid air, a silent testament to a breach in the day's perfect harmony. For a few more precious moments, Janet Peterson's world remained whole, her mind still occupied by the simple, comforting calculus of motherhood. She turned from the window, her thoughts shifting to the sandwiches that needed slicing. It was a mundane action, one she had performed thousands of times, yet it would soon be seared into her memory as the last peaceful act of her life. A few minutes later, around 3:30 p.m., she wiped her hands on her apron, poured 3 tall glasses of lemonade until they beaded with condensation, and called out, her voice warm and cheerful, "Emma, come get your friend some drinks." Silence answered her. Not the mischievous silence of children engrossed in a game of hiding, but a profound, unnatural stillness that seemed to swallow her voice whole. It was a vacuum where the vibrant energy of 3 little girls had just been. She waited a beat, a flicker of maternal impatience surfacing. Girls, lemonades ready, still nothing. The only response was the distant, monotonous hum of a neighbor's air conditioning unit and the rustle of oak leaves in a slight breeze. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy. It was a presence. A cold knot began to form in the pit of her stomach. A primal, maternal alarm that bypassed rational thought. She abandoned the sandwiches and lemonade on the counter and stepped out onto the back porch. The yard. Moments ago, a vibrant stage for imaginary adventures, was now eerily empty. The swing set sat motionless. A forgotten doll lay face down in the grass. The air, thick with heat, was now also thick with dread. "Emma, Lucy, Mia," she called again, her voice louder now, laced with an urgency that startled even herself. Her eyes darted around the perimeter of the fenced yard, a space she had always considered a sanctuary. She checked behind the sprawling lilac bushes, their sweet scent now cloying and sickening. She circled the large storage shed at the back of the property, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Nothing. Her gaze fell again on the back gate, its slight opening now looking less like an oversight and more like a gaping wound. She ran to it. The metal latch was cool beneath her trembling fingers. It swung open easily, revealing the dusty, sun-baked alley that ran behind the houses of Maple Drive. A wave of nausea washed over her. She was a careful mother, a meticulous mother. She knew she had secured that latch. Panic, cold and sharp, now took hold. She raced through the house, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet, and burst out the front door, her eyes scanning the street. Perhaps they had simply tired of the backyard and moved their game to the sidewalk. But the street was as empty as the yard. Mrs. Chen from next door was tending to her rose bushes, her face serene until she saw the raw panic etched onto Janet's. "Have you seen Emma and her friends?" Janet asked, her voice tight, struggling for control. Mrs. Chen straightened up, setting down her watering can, her expression shifting to one of concern. "Not for the past hour or so," she replied thoughtfully. "They were making quite a racket earlier, playing some kind of spy game by that big oak tree of yours." "Is everything all right, dear?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Within minutes, what had started as a flicker of worry had ignited into a full-blown inferno of fear. Janet's frantic calls to the Brennan and Rodriguez homes confirmed the unthinkable: the other girls weren't home either. Soon. The quiet afternoon on Maple Drive was shattered. Doors opened. Neighbors spilled out onto their lawns, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The initial, frantic search by the parents quickly expanded, blossoming into a desperate, grassroots effort by half the neighborhood. Adults, their faces grim, split into methodical groups. They fanned out, a tide of growing dread washing over a 6-block radius, checking every yard, every unlocked garage, every conceivable hiding spot. With every empty space they checked, the terrifying truth began to solidify. The girls were not hiding. They were gone. Just after 500 dpe. As the afternoon sun began its slow, merciless descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the neighborhood, the first police car arrived. Its flashing blue and red lights felt like an alien intrusion, painting the tranquil suburban street in the stark, terrifying colors of an emergency. Detective Ray Sullivan of the Milbrook Police Department stepped out of his vehicle, a 20-year veteran with premature gray hair and kind, weary eyes. Sullivan had seen the spectrum of human tragedy, but something about this situation felt different from the start. 3 children, vanishing simultaneously from a secured backyard in the middle of a Saturday afternoon, was not just unusual. It was unprecedented in this quiet community. He found the 3 sets of parents clustered together in the Petersons' living room, a small island of shared agony in a sea of encroaching nightmare. Their faces were masks of disbelief and raw terror. As evening fell outside, Detective Sullivan began the painstaking process of deconstructing the afternoon. His voice gentle but firm. Janet recounted the day's events, her own voice a stranger to her ears, breaking only when she described the last time she saw the girls laughing together by the oak tree. The other parents could only add fragments, confirming that their daughters were responsible children who knew the rules, who would never wander off, who would never talk to strangers. As the official investigation mobilized, more details emerged, each one deepening the mystery rather than clarifying it. A jogger, interviewed by a patrol officer, recalled seeing a dark-colored van parked near the end of Maple Drive around 3:30, but couldn't provide a make, model, or license plate. It was just a van. An unremarkable detail from an afternoon that had not yet become a tragedy. Miss Patterson, an elderly woman who lived across the alley, mentioned hearing what sounded like children's laughter around 3:45 p.m., but it had seemed strangely distant, moving away from the neighborhood. By nightfall, the search had transformed into a massive operation, with canine units and volunteers from surrounding communities descending on Milbrook. The dogs, brought to the backyard, picked up the girl's scent immediately. They followed it with intense focus, leading their handlers directly to the edge of back gate and approximately 50 yards down the alley. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The trail went cold, vanishing on the sun-baked asphalt as if the children had been lifted straight into the sky. The first 48 hours, the window that law enforcement considers most critical in missing persons cases, passed with an agonizing, torturous slowness. With each ticking second, hope bled away, replaced by a cold, heavy despair. The local search expanded, and the FBI arrived from Nashville, bringing with them a sense of federal gravity and a team of seasoned experts in child abduction. They established a command center in the Milbrook Community Center, the same building that hosted cheerful town meetings and children's summer camps, now transformed into a nerve center of grim-faced agents and ringing phones. The investigation became an exhaustive, methodical dissection of the community's life. Every neighbor, every family member, every delivery driver who had been in the area that Saturday was interviewed, their statements cross-referenced and analyzed. But the efforts yielded frustratingly little. With no security cameras to consult and no credible witnesses to the moment of disappearance, the investigation was a ghost hunt, relying entirely on the ephemeral currency of human memory and the stark absence of physical evidence. The media descended like a storm, and by the end of the week, the disappearance of Emma Peterson, Lucy Brennan, and Mia Rodriguez was national news. Their smiling school photos were broadcast across the country. 3 innocent faces that became a symbol for every parent's deepest, most primal fear. For the families, life became an unbearable public spectacle. Janet Peterson, thrust into the role of unofficial spokesperson, appeared on television, her face etched with a grief so profound it felt obscene to witness, pleading for any information. The Brennans, more private by nature, recoiled from the constant glare of the cameras, their anguish a silent, crushing weight. The Rodriguez family, still navigating their new life in a new town, found themselves adrift in a bewildering sea of reporters and investigators. Their language barrier, a cruel wall that complicated their every interaction. As weeks bled into months, the crushing truth began to settle over Milbrook like a permanent winter. There were no new leads, no credible sightings, no ransom demands. There was only a profound and terrifying silence, the national media, having exhausted every angle, packed up their satellite trucks, and moved on to the next tragedy, leaving a void that felt even louder than the previous chaos. The FBI, despite their resources, were forced to scale back their active involvement. Detective Sullivan, though he never truly gave up, saw the case files grow thicker with reports that led nowhere. His own frustration and quiet desperation, a mirror of the family's agony. After 6 agonizing months, the active investigation was officially suspended. The case would remain open, a permanent, unsolved file in the Milbrook Police Department. But the daily, urgent search for the girls was over. This was the true climax of the tragedy. Not a loud, violent explosion, but a slow, suffocating implosion of hope. The great, terrible revelation was not a discovery, but an absence, the dawning, soul-crushing certainty that there would be no answers. For the community of Milbrook, the dream of suburban safety was dead, and its ghost would haunt them forever. The unspoken trust that had bound them together dissolved, corroded by a miasma of suspicion and fear. Neighbors who had once shared backyard barbecues now exchanged wary glances over their fences. For sale signs began to appear on lawns like stark, white tombstones, as families fled the tragedy-stricken town, seeking a fresh start in a place not tainted by such a profound loss. The easy, ambient sound of children playing outdoors was replaced by an eerie, watchful quiet. The annual summer block parties on Maple Drive, once a cherished tradition, ceased entirely. And a permanent, unspoken grief settled over the street. For the 3 families at the heart of the storm, life became a form of purgatory. They existed in a liminal space between loss and possibility. Their lives defined by a question that had no answer. Every ring of the telephone, every knock at the door, carried a sickening jolt of hope and dread. They exhausted their savings on private investigators, chased down every psychic tip and prison confession. Each dead end another small death. The immense, unrelenting strain took its devastating toll, leading to lost jobs, failing health, and, in the case of the Brennans, the eventual, quiet fracturing of a marriage that could no longer withstand the weight of their shared, unspoken sorrow. The vibrant, loving community of Milbrook was gone. In its place stood a town of strangers, forever united and divided by the 3 small ghosts who had vanished in the bright, unforgiving light of a summer afternoon. The years that followed were a long, slow erosion of the soul. For the families, hope, once a burning star, became a distant, flickering ember, barely perceptible in the suffocating darkness of not knowing. For Detective Ray Sullivan, the 3 smiling faces from the missing posters became permanent residents in the haunted corridors of his memory. A testament to a failure he could never reconcile. For Milbrook, the tragedy became a part of its identity, a foundational myth of lost innocence that was passed down to a new generation of children who played indoors. The world moved on. Decades passed, and the silence from that summer afternoon in 1989 remained absolute, a seemingly permanent and unbreakable seal upon the truth. Until it wasn't. The truth did not re-emerge with a whisper, but with the jarring crunch of an excavator's bucket tearing into the rotted facade of a forgotten building in the summer of 2023. The old, derelict electronics repair shop on the outskirts of town, a place that had been boarded up and left to decay since the mid-1990s, was finally being demolished. It was inside this time capsule of neglect, behind a loose panel in what was once a back room, that a construction foreman discovered a cardboard box. Inside, nestled amongst decaying ephemera of the 1980s, were the 3 cassette tapes. The foreman, a man who had been a teenager in Milbrook during that summer of fear, immediately understood the potential gravity of his discovery. He contacted the Milbrook Police Department, and the tapes, artifacts from a cold, dead case, were carefully logged and transported back to the station. their discovery sending a jolt of electricity through the quiet halls. The responsibility for these ghosts of the past fell to Detective Maria Santos, a sharp, meticulous investigator in her early 40s. Santos had inherited the cold case files for Emma, Lucy, and Mia when Detective Sullivan retired. She had reviewed the thick, dusty binders multiple times over the years, always hoping to find an overlooked detail, a new avenue to pursue, but had always been met with the same frustrating dead ends. The discovery of the tapes was the first tangible piece of new evidence to surface in 34 years. Her first step was to identify the history of the building. Records showed the shop, Vance's Electronics, had been owned and operated by a single individual, Harold Vance, a reclusive man in his 50s who had run the business alone from 1985 until his death from a sudden heart attack in 1994. He had lived in a small apartment above the shop, had no known family or close friends, and his death had been as quiet and unnoticed as his life. The building's ownership had passed to a distant cousin who, unwilling to deal with the expense of clearing it out, had simply boarded it up, inadvertently creating a perfect, undisturbed tomb for its secrets. The task of listening to the tapes was approached with the solemnity of a sacred rite. Detective Santos, joined by FBI Special Agent Karen Walsh, who was called in due to the federal jurisdiction over historical child abduction cases, set up the equipment in a secure, soundproofed room at the police station. An old, meticulously maintained cassette deck was connected to modern recording and analysis software. The two women, both seasoned professionals accustomed to the darkest aspects of human nature, steeled themselves for what they might hear. The first tape, its label bearing the single, neatly written word, Emma, was inserted into the deck. With a soft click, the play button was pressed, and after 34 years of silence, the ghosts began to speak. The recording did not begin with a voice, but with a sound, the distinct, heavy thud of a solid door closing, followed by the sharp, metallic click of a lock. The audio quality was poor, clouded by a persistent low hum, but the next sounds were chillingly clear, the muffled, terrified sobs of young children. Then a voice, small but astonishingly clear, cut through the static, a voice that belonged to an 8-year-old girl trying desperately to sound brave. "Please," the voice said, "we want to go home. Our parents are looking for us." It was unmistakably Emma Peterson. A moment of silence passed, thick with menace, before a second voice responded. It was an adult male, his words distorted by the primitive recording equipment, his tone unnervingly calm, almost gentle. "You're going to be here for a while," the voice droned. "You need to be good girls and do exactly what I say." For the next 47 minutes, Santos and Walsh sat frozen, listening to a symphony of horror. The man, whom they now knew to be Harold Vance, methodically questioned the girls, asking their names, their ages, details about their families. Their answers came in small, frightened whispers, their compliance a heartbreaking testament to their terror. The remainder of the first tape was a raw, unfiltered document of their ordeal. The girls could be heard talking amongst themselves, their whispers a fragile web of comfort in an ocean of fear. They described being in a small, dark room with no windows. They mentioned the man, Vance, working on something nearby that made strange electronic humming sounds. Lucy could be heard crying softly for her mother, while Mia, the youngest, repeatedly asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, when they could go home. Emma, ever the leader, could be heard trying to soothe them, her own fear a palpable tremor beneath her words of reassurance. The second and third tapes, which the girls' own references to sleeping and being given food indicated were recorded on subsequent days, chronicled a devastating descent into despair. Their attempts at planning an escape faded. Their conversations grew shorter, the silences between them longer and heavier, punctuated only by the raw, exhausted sounds of weeping. Emma's attempts to maintain a brave front began to falter, her voice cracking with a fear she could no longer conceal. But it was the final tape, the one labeled Mia, that shattered the professional composure of the two investigators. The audio quality was significantly worse, the girls' voices barely audible. Long stretches contained only an agonizing silence, broken by an occasional, hopeless sob. Near the end of the recording, Vance's voice returned, but the audio was so degraded that his words were largely unintelligible. The tape, and the story it told, ended abruptly, cutting out mid-sentence, leaving behind an eternal, horrifying question mark. For several long minutes after the tape hissed into silence, neither Santos nor Walsh spoke. They had just borne witness to the final days of three little girls, and the weight of that terrible privilege was crushing. The discovery of the tapes and the horrifying truth they contained acted as a defibrillator on the heart of the cold case. The investigation was reignited with an intensity that dwarfed the original efforts of 1989. A joint task force was immediately established, combining the resources of the Milbrook PD, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. The tapes were sent to the FBI's Forensic Audio Lab in Quantico, where experts used cutting-edge technology to enhance the recordings. Their analysis yielded crucial details. The electronic humming sounds were confirmed to be consistent with the testing equipment used in television and radio repair in that era. Faint traffic noises audible in the background of one recording were analyzed and found to be consistent with the shop's location near Highway 96. Most significantly, voice analysis experts created a profile of Harold Vance's speech, a slight southern accent, a pattern consistent with a man in his 40s or 50s, and a subtle, almost imperceptible lisp with a name and a voice. Investigators began to exhume Harold Vance's life, and the portrait that emerged was that of a predator who had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. A call to his former employer in Memphis, a larger electronics company where he had worked before opening his own shop, uncovered a disturbing revelation. Vance had been terminated in 1983 for inappropriate behavior around children who visited the store with their parents, while no formal charges had ever been filed. The company had received multiple complaints about Vance making children uncomfortable, asking them probing personal questions when their parents were distracted. Further research revealed a pattern. Before Memphis, he had worked for a television repair service in Little Rock, Arkansas. Before that, an appliance store in Jackson, Mississippi. In each location, he had lived alone, formed few social connections, and left quietly after a few years. He was a ghost, deliberately avoiding scrutiny while maintaining jobs that gave him legitimate access to homes and families. As news of the discovery inevitably leaked to the press, it triggered a media firestorm, and the ghosts of 1989 were resurrected in the national consciousness. The now adult children who had lived in Milbrook that summer came forward, their insignificant childhood memories now cast in a sinister new light. Several recalled seeing Vance's nondescript repair van parked in their neighborhoods in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, often in locations where he would have had a clear view of children at play. He had been hunting. The most difficult task, however, fell to Detective Santos. After reviewing the initial recordings, she knew she had to contact the families. The phone call to Janet Peterson, now a woman in her late 60s, was the hardest of Santos's 15-year career. How do you tell a mother that after 34 years of silence, you have found her daughter's voice, only to deliver it packaged with an unimaginable horror? for Janet. Hearing Emma's voice again was both a miraculous gift and an exquisite form of torture. Santos played a small, carefully selected portion of the tape for her over the phone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, broken only by a soft, ragged breath. She sounded so scared. Janet finally whispered, her voice thick with a grief that 34 years had not diminished. But she was trying to be brave. That's my Emma, always trying to take care of everyone else. The knowledge contained within those tapes, once unleashed from its 3-decade tomb, became a new and more insidious kind of poison. For 34 years, the families had been tormented by the vast, empty, and maddening canvas of the unknown. They had imagined countless scenarios, from the hopeful to the horrific, but all were phantoms of the mind. Now, that canvas was violently filled with the horrifying, specific, and unerasable details of their daughter's final days. The abstract mystery that had defined their lives collapsed into a concrete, unbearable reality. The silence had been broken, but what replaced it was an unending scream. For Janet Peterson, the audio of Emma's bravery was a source of both profound maternal pride and a new, sharper, more intricate pain. The knowledge that her daughter had been a protector to the very end was a confirmation of the fierce, loving spirit she had always known. But it also meant that Emma had shouldered a burden of terror and responsibility that no child should ever have to bear. A realization that brought with it a fresh wave of helpless, retroactive grief. The community of Milbrook, which had long ago processed the tragedy into a sad, historical footnote, a story to tell new residents. A reason for the annual memorial was forced to confront the raw, unhealed wound anew, the monster that had haunted their town for decades. A formless, nameless specter of fear now had a name and a face. It was not the face of a cartoon villain, but the unremarkable, forgettable face of Harold Vance, the quiet repairman. This revelation did not bring the clean, cauterizing release of closure. It brought a sickening, wholesale re-evaluation of the past. The collective guilt that had plagued the parents of 1989, the persistent, gnawing feeling that they hadn't been watchful enough, was partially absolved, only to be replaced by the chilling and more intimate realization that they had been living alongside a predator who had expertly weaponized their greatest strength, their trust, against them. Every memory of that era was now tainted. Every forgotten, casual wave to a neighbor, every unlocked door, every child playing freely in a yard was now viewed through the horrifying lens of Vance's unseen, watchful eyes. The very foundation of their shared memory was violently redefined, not by a tragic, random act of fate, but by a calculated, patient, and predatory evil that had stalked their children from the shadows of their idyllic lives. The renewed investigation, now armed with the perpetrator, took on a new, grim urgency. The site of the former electronics shop, already partially demolished, was immediately declared a protected crime scene. Forensic teams from the FBI and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation descended upon the dilapidated structure, their white hazmat suits a stark contrast to the decay. They meticulously deconstructed the building, peeling back the layers of time with painstaking care. Their search yielded more heartbreaking evidence. Tucked deep within a wall cavity in the same back room, they found a small, bundled collection of children's clothing. The fabric was faded and brittle with age, but the patterns were still recognizable. They matched the descriptions of the outfits Emma, Lucy, and Mia had been wearing on the day they disappeared. FBI behavioral analysts, using the raw audio from the tapes, the physical evidence, and the newly uncovered history of Vance's life, constructed a chillingly detailed profile. They concluded that he was a highly organized, patient, and sexually sadistic predator who had likely been planning the abduction for some time. Studying the neighborhood's routines and identifying his targets with cold precision, the act of recording their voices, they noted, was not a mistake, but a core feature of his pathology, a desire to preserve the experience, to create permanent, private trophies of his crime that he could revisit and relive. But the most haunting and critical question remained unanswered. The tapes provided a horrifying, minute-by-minute narrative of the girl's captivity, but they offered no clues as to their ultimate fate. The abrupt, jarring end of the final recording was a cliffhanger from which there was no escape, a permanent ellipsis in the story. Had Vance panicked? Had the girls been moved? The investigators were left with nothing but speculation. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the entire property and the surrounding land, its electronic eyes searching for any disturbance in the earth. But the search revealed nothing. No graves, no remains, no answers. Harold Vance, in his quiet, anonymous death, had taken that final, terrible secret with him to the grave, leaving the families with a new, more defined, but equally painful form of limbo. The summer of 2024 marked 35 years since the girls had vanished from the backyard on Maple Drive. The families, now bound together by a new, shared, and more terrible knowledge, organized a memorial service at the Milbrook Community Center. The same building that had once served as the frantic, hopeful command center for the initial search now hosted a solemn, heartbreaking celebration of 3 lives cut short. Detective Sullivan, now in his late 70s, his body frail but his eyes still sharp, attended the service. He had spent the past months working alongside Detective Santos, poring over every detail of the original case files in light of the new evidence. For him, the truth brought a measure of professional peace, an end to the gnawing question of who, but it was a peace laced with the bitter, undiluted poison of regret. We did everything we could with the resources and the knowledge we had at the time, Sullivan stated during his remarks, his voice heavy with the authentic weight of decades of unresolved grief. But these girls deserved justice, and their families deserved answers. The fact that Harold Vance was operating his business, his prison, just miles from our command center while we searched elsewhere, that is a failure I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The service also marked the official launch of the Emma, Lucy, and Mia Foundation, established by the families to transform their decades of private pain into a public legacy of protection. The Foundation's mission was twofold: to provide funding for advanced forensic techniques to be used in other cold cases, and to offer financial and emotional resources for other families trapped in the same agonizing limbo of not knowing. It was an act of profound grace, an attempt to build something hopeful and enduring from the ashes of their own shattered lives. They knew better than anyone that for every case that is solved, there are thousands that remain in the cold, dark silence of the unknown, and they were determined that their daughter's story would, in the end, be a light for others lost in that same darkness. In the end, the story of the Milbrook 3 is a story without a final chapter, a book with its last page violently torn out. The tapes provided a voice for the voiceless but could not provide a grave for the grieving. The legal case is officially closed. The perpetrator has been identified and is long dead. But the emotional case, the human case, will remain open forever in the hearts of those who lived through it and in the memory of the town it redefined. The diabolical genius of Harold Vance was not in the brutal commission of his crime, but in his chillingly accurate understanding of the community he chose to infiltrate. He knew that, in a place built on the bedrock of trust, The most effective and terrifying monster is the one who looks just like everyone else. His legacy, therefore, is not just the tragic loss of three young lives, but the murder of an idea, the simple, beautiful, and devastatingly naive idea that a quiet street and a locked gate can ever truly keep the darkness at bay. The ancient oak tree in the Peterson family's backyard continues to grow. Its branches, once the scaffolding for imaginary forts, now stretch far beyond the property line, a silent, living monument to a summer afternoon in 1989. Janet Peterson, now in the twilight of her years, her own health failing, still tends to a small, lovingly maintained memorial garden beneath its shade. There are bright, defiant sunflowers for Emma's bright, defiant personality, fragrant, calming lavender for Lucy's gentle, calming nature and resilient, beautiful roses for Mia's quiet, surprising courage. The tree stands as a witness, its deep, concentric rings holding the memory of a time when children's laughter filled the air, and the terrible, echoing silence that followed. It serves as a final, enduring reminder that even when the trail goes cold and the voices fade into static, the truth can lie dormant for years, for decades, waiting patiently in a forgotten box, ready to speak its terrible, incomplete story to a world that must never, ever be allowed to forget.